So this evening we will be in Genesis. I don't think that's a great surprise or anything, but just so you know, we will be in Genesis. I do appreciate everyone being here this evening. I appreciate the chance to be able to speak to you. We're going to be in chapter 12. We're going to look at verse 9 down through the end of the chapter, which is not really that long because it's only 20 verses for the whole chapter. So 11 verses, basically, 11 or 12. So we're following Abram and trying to learn the lessons that we can learn from his experiences. And, we know while Abram is faithful and a friend to God, we know that he's not perfect and he does make mistakes, and that's no offense to him. It's just, he's still an important patriarch to us. Our covenant comes down through his covenant with the Lord, and of course, Jesus also comes down through his line. So this evening, Abram is going to take a trip to Egypt. And while I'm a little silly there, they weren't taking selfies with any phones or anything, but they do go down to Egypt due to a famine that they encounter. Now, when we left Abram last, he had pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai. So let's look at that on the map. And I tried to do a better job this time, and I actually circled it there, Bethel and Ai. So he pitched his tent between these two towns, and Ai sometimes on some maps is pictured more on a level with Bethel and sometimes a little below. That probably just means we're not 100% sure exactly where it is, but it's in this general area. So Bethel and Ai are like that, and that's where he was. And notice too, if you look down, if you go southward down the picture, you'll see Jerusalem. So this is just north up above Jerusalem. So if we start with our first verse here in chapter 12, verse 9. So Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. If you'll notice, in my translation, I'm not sure if everybody's does this, but south is capitalized. And if you look this up, like I looked it up in the interlinear, in the Hebrew, it's really the Negev. Now they say also some may have it as Negeb. And Negev, let me just show you on the map here. Down here I've got it underlined at the bottom. Negev ends with a V, but it said that some have it as Negeb, which would end with a B, as in bee or boy. So the first B word I can think of. Anyway, so I had to kind of switch maps just to try to show this properly. Bethel and Ai are up north. And so this is just kind of showing the path he took down to the Negev. And notice Beersheba is right there. Though it's not mentioned here in our scripture, it'll be important to remember where that is, that it's there with the Negev in another map we'll look at later. So the Negev essentially is southern Judah. Sometimes they call it the low country. Sometimes they just call it south, like they did in that scripture there where it's capitalized and it just says south, which seems strange to us, but I'm sure that was more meaningful to them at that time or whatever. But the real Hebrew word was Negev, so maybe that doesn't matter. Okay, so yeah, you can see the path here. You can also notice that blue line continues on down and is kind of showing or pointing the way to where Abram and they go down to Egypt. So let's look at our next verses here. If we look at verses 10 and 11, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came to pass, when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarah his wife, "Indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance." Let's take a look at the map here. Notice they're getting close to Egypt. And this is why I said to notice Beersheba is there at the Negev, because they're traveling from Beersheba over to, and I circled this whole big area of Egypt. It doesn't really say where they go in Egypt, so I'm not going to try to say because I don't know, but somewhere. And so at this point, they're getting close to Egypt, all right? If we go to our verses here, let's see, it says when he was close to entering Egypt. So they're not quite in Egypt yet when he's saying this. Now, one thing I want us to notice here in verse 10, And think about this for a minute. God had called Abram, and Abram was following God in faith. He goes down to the promised land like he's supposed to. And the first thing, basically, about the first thing he encounters is a famine. Not exactly something that would give you a lot of encouragement, right, about this being a good land or anything. And just, he's facing adversity right off the bat. Here he is, he's following the Lord, doing what the Lord has called him to do. And the first thing he runs into is trouble. Because a famine, that's definitely a hardship. That's definitely a trial, right? They just left their family in Haran. It was him and Sarah and Lot, and I know they had some people and some animals with them. Don't know exactly how many. But they had just left, and they came down here to where God had told him to go for a famine. That doesn't seem like a good thing, right? That could be taken in a bad way. That could be discouraging. But this is supposed to be the good land and a good promise for him. And so what I'm thinking of as I talk about that is like, as we follow the Lord, we also encounter these trials, these hardships in life, these bad things. How do we react to those things? Do we continue on in faith? Do we continue to follow the Lord and get through those things? Or do we want to give up? Do we get frustrated? Do we get discouraged? We're going to have trials in this life. Do we want to give up? Do we want to go back to our old life? Because, that's not a good thing. We don't want to do that. We're going to face trials and troubles. And notice this is a trouble. He didn't cause this. He has no control over this. This is just something that happened. We're going to have things like that in our lives where we don't control it. It's not some punishment for us. It's just something that occurs in this fallen world. So it still is a trial, and it's something that we have to face and we have to deal with even if we don't want to. So when we face those things, are we giving up? Are we telling God, hey, this is too hard, this is too much? We don't want to get to the point where we're like, hey, it's too hard to be a Christian. I don't want all this trouble, right? I was comfortable in my old life, God. That's the way some people are. And we don't want to be that way. And we don't see Abram being that way. So he's a good example in that sense for us. And so just wants to think along those lines. Are we determined and committed to following the Lord even through those hard times? Because we're going to have those hard times. And when we get discouraged, do we give up, or do we rise up and really seek God and seek him and get that encouragement from him and continue on? And sometimes you may hear people say things like, well, I thought it was going to be easy. I thought once I was saved and I was following the Lord, everything would be okay and I wouldn't have any more troubles in life. But we know better than that, right? But some people have actually been told that if they get baptized, well, all your problems will go away. But that's not the way it works at all. We know that. So we want to keep that in mind as we go through this life, know that we're going to have troubles and trials. That following the Lord, it is the best life. It is the absolute best life there is. But it's going to be challenging. There's going to be some hard times. And it's especially difficult maybe for new Christians. So we want to be aware of that and be willing and ready to help them as needed, because they're not necessarily going to know what to expect. And they may have this mistaken attitude that when they're baptized, that suddenly everything will be roses. But that's not the way that any of this works. So we want to be aware of that. Because none of us are immune to trials and difficulties in this life. So we should expect those trials and those troubles and be prepared. Stay in the Word, stay in prayer, and be ready for those things, whether you're in good times or bad. But especially when you're in good times, prepare. Get that good relationship with God. Have everything going the way it should be. Be where you ought to be, so when that hard time comes, you know how to handle it. Because it will come at some point. So continue, stay in the faith, trust God to bring you through whatever you're going through, And remember, again, like I said, we're promised tribulation here in this life, but we are also promised deliverance. And I do want to look at, I may sound like a downer, but I do want us to look at some encouraging verses before we go back to our verses there in Genesis. If we look at Psalm 34, verse 17, the righteous cry out, and the Lord hears, and delivers them out of all their troubles. We can always trust the Lord, no matter what circumstance we're in. We can always trust Him to hear us and to help us. The Lord is always faithful to us. If we look at Psalm 55:22, cast your burden on the Lord, and He shall sustain you. He shall never permit the righteous to be moved. And this is a little similar, at least I feel like it goes with 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 and 7, where he says, therefore, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that He may exalt you in due time, casting all your care upon Him, for He cares for you, because the Lord does care for us. And we should give Him our cares, let Him know what those cares and troubles are. And then if we look at Isaiah 65, verse 24, now here God is talking to His people, His elect people. It shall come to pass that before they call, I will answer, and while they are still speaking, I will hear. So again, God hears us. He will answer us. He will give us the best answer, even if we don't know what to ask for. And sometimes we don't know the solution, but God always knows and has the solution, and we can trust in Him. If we look at John chapter 16, verse 33, and of course, this is the Lord. The context for this is the Lord speaking to the apostles. This is that last night before He's betrayed. It's the last times, some of the last time He has with them, and He's stressing a lot of very important things to them. So this is still very important to us as well. He warns us and He encourages us at the same time. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. Of course, we're going to have trouble in this fallen world, but Jesus has already won the battles for us. There's no tribulation here that can keep us out of our ultimate deliverance and promise and destination. We just need to stay faithful. So coming back to Genesis after I go off on my tangent, coming back to Genesis here in verse 10, you might recognize this. This is a little bit of a foreshadow of Jacob and Joseph and how there was a famine in the land and they went down to Egypt. I'm not telling the whole story in a good order, but you get the idea. This is kind of a foreshadow of that. Abram encounters a famine. He heads down to Egypt where there's better resources, that type of thing. So he's not planning to stay there forever either. He's just going down there to wait out the famine. This is not like a plan to move to Egypt forever. Now, we don't see Abram consult God specifically on this, but we do see back in our prior verses that he was calling on the name of the Lord. So he was communicating with God. We don't know how much in this particular instance just because it's not mentioned, but obviously he had been building altars and had a relationship with God. However, we also know that Abram does not always make the right decision. He is imperfect just like the rest of us. And in verse 11, we see Abram he's starting to he's leading into getting into a little bit of trouble. I'll say it that way. He's telling, not with his wife though. He's just telling her how beautiful she is. And of course, I think everybody would appreciate that if their husband tells them how beautiful they are. That would be all right. So that's not the trouble. Let's move on to our next verses here in verses 12 and 13. Therefore it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. And really what he means is they're going to kill me and they're going to take you. So that's really what he means. Please say you are my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I may live because of you. So the way he's saying this, she can save his life by being his sister instead of being his wife. And we know that they are, she is like a half-sister to him. But that was then. So we need to understand that Abram and Sarah and Lot here, they're going down into a foreign country. And this is not even like today. The world is not even as civil and everything as it is today. And there's parts of the world today that aren't very civil. But this is an even, worse time back then. And so they're going somewhere where they don't have any friends. They don't have any family. They don't have any support. All they have are themselves. And then here, we don't see Abram go to God with this concern, but instead this fear, he's feeling vulnerable, and he reacts in fear. So he's making a bit of a bad decision, not a bit of a bad decision, he's making a bad decision. He's making a bad decision because of that fear, because he's worried. Sometimes when we're in unfamiliar territory, when we're in places where we're not comfortable, sometimes we will have some fear, some worry, some trepidation. And if we're not careful, we'll let that kind of run over us and we'll make bad decisions. It can happen to anybody. That's part of being human. But it's something we want to be aware of and watch out for. So unfortunately, Abram, he's forgetting God's promise to him. And his promise to Abram, as we'll especially see later in this study, but his promise is to Abram, but it's also to Sarah, his wife, because remember how God sees us when we're married. He sees us as one. We are one. So Sarah and Abram are one. And what the promise that God made to Abram, he also made to Sarah. And like I said, you'll see later, as if you haven't already, but anyway, we will see later that God stresses that Sarah is to be the mother of the child to come, not anyone else. So that's why I say this is a promise to Abram, but that also does include Sarah. And for that promise to come true, Abram's not fully putting his trust in God. For that promise to come true, Abram has to be alive, and Sarah still has to be his wife. So he's kind of reacting out of fear. Like I said, he's going to get himself into a little bit of trouble here, and he's not consulting God on this. Sometimes this happens when we let our fear get the better of us, when we get overly worried. So now, to be fair though, Abram's fears are not totally unfounded. If we look at the next verses 14 through 16, so it was when Abram came into Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful. The princes of Pharaoh also saw her and commended her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. He treated Abram well for her sake. He had sheep, oxen, male donkeys, male and female servants, female donkeys, and camels. Pardon me. So notice the words there for very beautiful in my translation are exceedingly beautiful. She was really very, very beautiful. And if you think about it, in those days, these people that were in charge, they call them princes, assuming that they're royalty or higher ups in this area. Those are the people that usually took all the pretty women for themselves, right? In the old world, that's just the way life was. If you had power, you had what you wanted, and everybody else could just do without. So she was really pretty if they were seeing her and wanting her. And then she was so pretty, they didn't take her for themselves. They commended her to Pharaoh, because if they took her, he was just going to take her from them anyway. So I'm just pointing out what seems obvious to me. And I know we don't always think of this, but she was really that beautiful for whatever reason. So they recommended her to Pharaoh, and then she was taken into Pharaoh's house. Now, I can't make a lot of assumptions here. Some people assume that she was taken into his harem or some such, but we don't know what Pharaoh this is. We don't know anything about this person. Does he even have a wife at this time? Does he have a harem? We don't know. But obviously he was taking her into her house with the plan of probably making her his wife, right? That's probably the idea. So to be fair, Abram had good reason to have his fears, because in some places, in some situations, they would have just killed him and took him. So just to be fair, it's not that his fear was totally unfounded, but he wasn't really trusting in the Lord. That's the point we want to make sure we see. And then there's just, as an odd aside, do you remember how old Abraham is about now? He's about 75. How old is Sarah? She's like 10 years younger. She's 65. Generally, somewhere in that ballpark. That's hard for us to wrap our minds around. But yeah, so she's like 65. Anyway, so she sounds like she's beautiful, like Helen of Troy beautiful, just stirring up all kinds of trouble just because she's pretty, you know. Not that she's doing anything on purpose. Don't take that the wrong way. But however, due to his deception, Abram now, he's receiving gifts. He's getting servants and animals. Back then, livestock, actually, if you look at being rich back then, livestock would be more important than money. You can't eat money, but you can eat livestock, and you can use work animals to do your fields and thus keep yourself and your family alive. That would have been way more in riches than money, though money was still important, I'm sure. But when you come down to survival, that would be way more important to have the animals and that type of thing. So those are big indicators of wealth back then. So in a way, Pharaoh is basically paying Abram a dowry for Sarah in a way. Now, it's not written explicitly that way, but that's how my mind thinks about it. That's what people used to do. So kind of that type of thing. Let's see. So we need to read these verses, 17 and 18. But the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife?" So we might question why God plagued Pharaoh, because it might seem kind of unusual, because you'd think, well, but isn't Abram in the wrong here? But God is still being faithful to Abram and his promise to him. He's watching out for Abram even when Abram is in the wrong. God is being faithful and showing Abram that he can trust him. He's delivering him, getting him out of this situation. He's bringing, Sarah back to him. So simply put, God is going to see his plan through. He's going to see his promise to Abram through. And the Lord's plans are not going to be derailed. Even when we do wrong or when we sin, God's plans are still going to go through. He's still going to push those plans through. So God is going to make sure that they have the offspring he promised. He's not going to allow them to be split up like that, because Jesus is going to come from that line. Let's look at the next verses, and this is really the last of the chapter as well. Why did you say, "She is my sister"? I might have taken her as my wife. Now therefore, here is your wife. Take her and go your way. So Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. So you notice that he says I might have taken her as my wife. And that just kind of makes me think he was heading down that road. But then these plagues happened. We don't get a good indication of how he knew now that God was plaguing him over this. Surely God let him know in some way, whether it be a dream or through someone else. But somehow he knew this was happening because of Sarah, and Sarah being Abram's wife. So this again kind of points, sometimes even when we mess things up, even when we make mistakes along the way, God will still make sure that his plan is carried out, no matter what wrong we do or how we mess things up. So we even see Abram here being blessed as they leave Egypt. You'll notice he takes all that stuff with him. Again, this kind of reminds me of when they leave Egypt and they take all those things that the people of Egypt gave them when the Lord delivered them and brought them out of bondage. This is similar to that, not exactly the same, but similar, in that Abram still comes away with all those things. So to close, I want us to see the main lesson here for us is to trust in the Lord. You know, we're going to face problems and issues, but we can trust God, our Father, to help us, to guide us through these things. We don't need to get creative in a bad way, in a deceptive way, to try to do it ourselves, right? We can trust in the Lord, and we should act and do the things correct that we know to do from the Bible. So if we get deceptive when we do those types of things, a lot of times it's just going to complicate the matter and make it worse on us. So we don't want to rely on the schemes of man, but we want to trust in the goodness of God. Abraham was faithful enough to leave his family up there in Haran, but then here we see that he gave in to fear and he was deceitful. And notice that Abram offended Pharaoh so that he could not remain there. So he didn't totally get out of all this scot-free. He had gone down there to wait out the famine. And now he can't stay there. He's offended Pharaoh, and so this deceit has cost him a possible ally or friend or some sort of support. So let's always endeavor, to stay the course and follow the Lord and not let these things push us. Don't let fear push us into doing something wrong or deceitful. God is always with us through these things. And if anyone here this evening needs any help for any reason to get back to the Lord, we have water. If anyone needs to be baptized, we would baptize you into Christ this evening. If anybody needs that, please let us know as we stand and sing.